Coming up in this episode.
The frustration for me is with businesses thinking internally and thinking parochially. The challenge is to think outside the box. And we both know the situation we try to tackle and still are tackling in Elupeg and other businesses, which is about the utilisation of vehicles around Europe. A third of HGVs running on the roads in Europe are empty. And of the ones not empty, they're about 60% full. And businesses don't appear to be capable of tackling this problem.
The Logistics Collective podcast is a series focused on the logistics industry, where there are many incredible stories to be told. We'll be speaking with those who've worked and are working within the industry today. What have been their experiences, good and bad, since joining, and would they recommend a career in the industry to others? Here's your host, Malcolm Pope.
Hello. Today I have the challenge of introducing a true legend of the supply chain and logistics industry. And it's going to be a long introduction. I'm going to have to apologise to the listener for that, but it is the absolutely appropriate thing to do. So, simply, his journey defies full description, but a flavour would be 40 years leading innovation and invention in the logistics and supply chain industry. And by innovation, I mean true original thought on how to make logistics and supply chain more efficient through modelling and use of technology. Our guest today has dreamt and delivered the logistics present we live in, but also has a keen eye on the future of sustainability in supply chain and logistics. So he's a University of Oxford graduate, and the foundation of his career was literally cast in steel, and from there he was further cast into leading logistics and supply chain roles in the consultancies PwC, that's PricewaterhouseCoopers, and FSO. But beyond the career in industry, he's been a leading light in academia, founding what is now the Cranfield Centre for Logistics and Supply Chain Management, and he's trained, inspired, and certainly provoked into action many of the logistics and supply chain leaders of today. A great proponent of pragmatism in the academic world, he has sought to create and promote alliance between industry and academia. Additionally, our guest has led many esteemed organisations, being former chairman and president of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, chairman of the European Council on Global Supply Chain, leadership of the Supply Chain Council, and served on the board of the European Logistics Association, and also was the founder and the key energy behind the European Logistics Users, Providers and Enablers Group, Elupeg, which has a key aim to drive collaboration in our logistics and supply chain, which is where I met him 20 years ago when I led the European Collaborative Working Group for the FMCG sector within Elupeg. He's been awarded many times for his contribution to the logistics and supply chain industry, including the Sir Robert Lawrence Gold Medal Award, the Honorary Fellowship of the CILT, a Lifetime Leadership Award from the Logistics Leaders Network, all topped off by being awarded an OBE for his services to the logistics industry. So there's Liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Carmen and Freeman of the City of London, who still found time to love and cherish his wife and 5 children, despite all these incredible endeavours in industry and academia, and I've certainly not listed them all. I offer a warm welcome to my friend, inspiration and mentor. Guess who? It's Professor Alan Waller. Hello, Alan. How are you?
Thank you very much, Malcolm. It's great to be here.
So today we're here to talk a little bit about your journey from the back streets of Wolverhampton all the way through to Buckingham Palace and meeting Her Late Majesty the Queen to receive your OBE, and really also thinking beyond that too. So I had a list of questions in my mind that were far more than 100 long, but I'm going to be really selective. So my first question to you, Alan, is why is logistics and supply chain so fascinating to you?
Well, Malcolm, thank you for the introduction. That's a very nice description of my career. I got into supply chain and logistics by chance, really, but it's a fascinating area, supply chain. It's really fundamental to practically everything we do in this world. The clothes we wear, the food we eat, our health, the defence of our country, every aspect of our life is touched by supply chain. And if we look at supply chain, we have to think not just of where we get these things from, like Marks and Spencer's or Tesco, but all the way back to raw materials, primary manufacturing, secondary manufacturing, distribution, channels to market, returns, recycling. It's a huge area that defies description in many ways, and most people don't really appreciate the power of supply chain. But once we start looking into how the supply chain is structured, how it works, we can realize the complexity of it, but also the beauty of it. Each business has a control of just a part of the supply chain it works within, but its success is dependent on the success of that total supply chain. If products don't arrive from China, or if from the Far East, or if we can't get the ingredients for a product, or if we can't get them to market because of whatever happens, then that's a major problem in the way in which we run our business. So we need to understand the extended supply chain, which is all the way through to, as I said, raw materials. And if any business wants to look at supply chain, we need to actually map the supply chain of which we are part, all the way from raw materials through returns, recycling, as I said. The challenges have developed over the years. I mean, in the 1960s, there was a focus up to then. There was a focus on manufacturing costs, but with the extended marketplaces, globalization in particular, the separation of manufacturing from the point of consumer created more transport and distribution costs. So the focus on manufacturing in the 60s was replaced in the 70s by thinking about manufacturing and distribution in totality, because the distribution costs can also be very significant and can outweigh manufacturing costs in many cases. And when we move on to the 80s, we get procurement coming in there. In other words, it's not just the manufacturing and getting the product to market, but it's the inbound logistics, both in terms of raw materials and in terms of finished goods that we may be passing on into the market. So the concept in the 1980s was to think about what was called total logistics. So the logistics activities from the start of the supply chain to the end. Then in 1993, the term supply chain management was developed and started to be used. Essentially, I see logistics as the skill set to manage this total supply chain, and it's that complexity that logistics as a function needs to be able to handle. If we move into the 2000s, we saw supply chain as being a source of competitive advantage in the marketplace. So it's not enough just to have the product at the right quality and the product at the right price, but the product has to be available to the customer. So if we look at companies like Coca-Cola, their mission is to have Coke within arm's reach of everybody on the planet. So that is a supply chain, a logistics task, but it's part of their marketing mission. I've done a huge amount of work for Unilever, and I'll probably talk about Unilever again later on, but I've worked for Unilever all around the world, not just in Europe, but in Asia Pacific, North America. And there was a sort of a very important occasion some years ago when I was working with the Unilever board in Rotterdam, and the chairman of Unilever at that time was Maurice Tabasblack, and I managed to get him on the platform with me at a conference, and he introduced the conference, which was a supply chain conference. And I thought that his quotation was so powerful, because he said, you can quote me on this, our focus in Unilever is on brands and consumers, but without an effective supply chain, we cannot begin to compete. And that was 30 years ago. And I think that's one statement by the chairman of Unilever changed the perception of many companies around Europe and around the world in terms of realizing how important supply chain was to delivering the business capability. So it's a fascinating area, Marco. Over the years I counted up 55 strategic supply chain studies that I've been involved in. 5 of them genuinely global ones. Most of them pan-European or pan-Asia Pacific or North American integration studies, and also a lot of country-based studies. But although each business and sector are different, there's a lot of commonality in the techniques, the supply chain techniques, the supply chain thinking that you can take the learning from and move from one sector to another. And I see consultancy and academia as being key players in actually cross-pollinating industries to take forward and take around best practice. Not only take in best practice, but learn from the successes and mistakes of businesses to take them on your journey yourself into other companies. The complexity is a huge challenge, and getting to grips with a new business and the complexity of their supply chain is a challenge that I love and have loved. Supply chain is interesting because it's top to bottom. It's both strategic, because we've heard from Unilever and other people that that's strategic to their business purpose. It's also operational. It's got to work. So, it's top to bottom. It's strategic and it's operational. It's also end to end. Any decision in any part of the supply chain must take into consideration the total supply chain. So, act local but think global, and that's again a source of great complexity. But it's essential to do that. It's also core to business, as we've heard, but it's also core to society. And if we look at how would we live our life without effective supply chains, when we start to get shortages of product, we realise how important supply chain is to every one of us. So supply chain, Malcolm, is a fascinating area, and I've thoroughly enjoyed how many years is it? 50 years, I think, working in supply chain.
Well, I applaud you on your half century, Alan, and I look forward to the next half century as well.
Thank you.
But I've always felt about supply chain and logistics, it is the science of making everything happen. And I think it's magical. But for you, where did the fascination come from, and when did it begin?
Well, as you said, Malcolm, my career was forged in steel, and I spent when I graduated, I joined British Steel at Corby. 45,000 people employed in an integrating iron, steel, and tube plant. I went into production management and spent some time as an assistant plant manager, and then moved into management services and spent time working through other parts of British Steel, because British Steel, it was integrated, it was vertically integrated. In other words, it had raw material extraction on site in Northamptonshire, iron making, steel making, coke ovens, clearly, heavy mills, tube finishing plants, and then export and distribution operations both in the UK and overseas. So I got involved in all aspects of that, which I didn't realise was supply chain until afterwards. But understanding the supply chain of British Steel from on the ground was really very valuable for my future career. I then moved into consultancy with Coopers & Lybrand, which is now PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, as you said. It's interesting because my first major supply chain study was in 1976. Goodness me, can you believe that?
It was a warm summer, Alan, wasn't it?
It was a very hot summer, yeah. The year of the ladybird, was it? But that was a study that took 18 months. It was for Monte Edison, which is a manufacturer of plastics in Italy, but looking at the European distribution operation. They didn't know how many warehouses they'd got. They had no idea how much product there was outside the factories. They had 4 factories in Italy, so they wanted to basically grasp the European situation to be able to get their arms around what was actually happening. And also, it was a genuine supply chain study, although it's called the distribution study, because one of the things we looked at was to where we should relocate a new factory, possibly outside Italy. So it was a European distribution study, but in fact it was supply chain. The interesting thing was, you talked about modelling. Models weren't available in those days as they are at the moment. We got lots of modelling systems for planning strategically across the supply chain, but in those days the models didn't exist. So I developed a thing called DSS, Distribution Strategy Simulator, which I'd written in Fortran 4, because that's one of the skills I picked up in British Steel when I worked for management services. But just to give you an idea of how the world's changed, in 1976, it took 6 months to actually collect any data. There were no ERP systems. There was no data outside of the manufacturing site in Italy. It took 6 months to collect the data. We had to get all the operating companies in Frankfurt for 2 days, explain the study, explain what information we needed in terms of distribution facilities, transport facilities, further processing, customer base. And then we had a very complex situation, so we developed a tailor-made model, which took 6 months, again, in Fortran 4. So these were the days when a study like that would take 18 months. And there was a huge learning curve from the whole team, including myself. If we fast forward the clock from 1976 to the 1990s, then that type of study could be done in 3 months, because the data was typically available within the businesses. because of the ERP systems and the extended technology that was available. That gave us access to data. And also, we have modeling systems now off the shelf. And I say system, it's not a model you can put in, but a modeling system where you've got the basic building blocks for a model, and you put it in place and then replicate what's happening in the business. So you can start to try different changes, what ifs, and develop strategic options and evaluate those very, very quickly once the model is built, of course. So the 18 months in Mount Tennyson was a long time. And what was frustrating about that is we're all very, very low down the learning curve, and we hadn't thought about implementation. So if we do a study like that nowadays, when you assemble the data and start the strategy process, it's absolutely essential to start to think about implementation at the very beginning. So the learning from that was certainly in terms of the difficulty of getting data and the difficulty of modeling, which have now been overcome. But the learning which needs to still move forward more generally is to think about implementation, because the implementation is absolutely critical. It doesn't matter how good a strategy we have. If it's not implementable, then it's of no use whatsoever. I mean, I'll talk later on about the work I've been doing between Cranfield and FSO over the last 15 years, looking at strategic change and the role of the supply chain leader and the role of supply chain in the boardroom. We've learned a huge amount. We know how to do this stuff now because of the experience of all these previous studies. So if you take an example as we moved into the 90s, a huge amount of work I did on the single European market as that was coming in, which should have happened on the 1st of January 1993. But one project which did go very well, because we'd learned a lot by then, was Johnson Wax. So for Johnson Wax, they made aerosols in countries around Europe, and also had bottles of things like toilet duct, which required filling facilities. But what we developed with Johnson Wax was a mega factory just south of Amsterdam to make aerosols for the whole of Europe. Because if we look at the economic footprint of aerosols, if you're able to have a single market, then instead of having aerosol factories all around Europe, you have the economic footprint is about 1,000 kilometers. So you can have a single aerosol plant in Amsterdam, put in the latest technology, very high volume. You can only support that investment if you have the volume coming through. But the volume for Europe was sufficient. If we take the bottles that were processed in filling plants, that's a far less capital-intensive investment for production than aerosols. So the strategy for toilet duct and other filled bottles was to move those to, instead of having them in every country, is to have 5 or maybe 6 filling plants around Europe to cover the marketplace. Because the economic footprint, or if you like, the area that you can serve from one manufacturing plant for filled bottles is more like 200 kilometers than 1,000 kilometers. So that was an example of a study that learnt a huge amount from the earlier studies that we were involved with. And that was one of many studies that I did across Europe. But also the similar concept in terms of NAFTA, North America Free Trade Alliance, did work in US and Canada. Again, sewing together the countries to look at a single supply chain strategy between the various countries, and also for Asia Pacific. It would be remiss not to mention Brexit, of course, because we went into Europe from a business point of view to actually access the single European market, and we now have decided not to do that. And of course, we have some difficulties in developing our trade with Europe. One suggestion is the Swiss type solution, but that's not going down too well among some of the Tory backbenchers. So I don't know where we're going, Mark, with this, but certainly in terms of my experience of supply chain, it's been fantastic moving from manufacturing through to some very challenging studies in Europe and around the world. And I think that if we look at what's happening at the moment, and you'll ask me a question about this no doubt later on, we're going to have to sort of revise our European strategies and our global strategies to take account of the implications, not just of Brexit, but of the risks worldwide in the positioning of Russia, of China. The Suez blockage was a wake-up call to say don't rely upon regular imports from the Far East. We've got to have a more agile and lean and responsive supply chain. But that was where my interest and experience in supply chain came from, Markham.
Thanks, Alan. And one of my colleagues in Laguru, a senior consulting partner, who was a student of yours, attests to your abilities in linear programming. So that's
right.
Robert
Good.
Harper says
Excellent.
hello to you in terms of that. So there you go. What's been the most difficult problem you've solved, and why and how?
Well, I must just refer back to linear programming because that's an operational research technique that I did have some expertise in. And I have used it in anger as a standalone tool, which I just mentioned very briefly. So one of those studies that I did was actually for Hunter Douglas in the Netherlands at their European factory, where the challenge there was to buy and blend raw materials and aluminium from different sources together with scrap aluminium to make the right product for different markets. So linear programming was actually applied in anger, and it worked.
I'm sorry to hear that, Alan.
So that's just an aside, Marco. But let's move on to your question then. The most difficult problem I've solved. Well, I've had a lot of difficult problems, and I haven't solved some. I've worked with others to solve them, but equally well, I've worked with others. We've had complete failures. So if you take those 55 strategic studies, some have been quite excellent. I've mentioned Johnson Wax. And another study I can think of that was really very difficult, but was very successful, was a multinational company working in Indonesia, where the market was growing at 30%, and the strategy was to actually get the company geared up in a difficult environment where transport was highly fragmented, the management was not skilled in supply chain. But to actually bring through a strategy to actually take the company forward in Indonesia. So a large business, the market growing at 30%, if they didn't grow at more than 30%, they were losing market share. So that was, and we achieved success there. And we started off thinking about implementation from the very beginning. And that was a real learning curve. I should just comment in terms of variability of success, that the practical research that I've done on many of these projects by this collaborative research between Cranfield School of Management and FSO was that the studies that we looked at, including the ones that I was involved in, had only a 50% success rate as measured in 2008. In other words, if you look at it, the strategic studies and looked at those that were successful, those that were not, 20% of the failed completely and were abandoned. This was a surprise to everybody, and the average success rate was 50%. So very successful, clearly. But that was a wake-up call again to the boards of companies and to consultants to actually try and understand what was happening in terms of these strategic studies, which tended to be done behind closed doors, either with consultants or without consultants, or with academics or without academics. But the success rate was appalling. And if we start to think about the cost of embarking on a strategic study, the management time involved, the cost involved, which may include consultants, it may not, and then to end up with a strategy that fails, it is not only a waste of money and time and effort, we also have a supertanker without a rudder because the company has no direction. We repeated that research in 2008. We published it. It was a continuous piece of research. But when we published in 2018, that success rate had gone up to about 65%. So you can see in that I have been involved in a lot of failures. So when people say you must be very experienced, I define experience as the sum of my previous mistakes. I am very experienced. The main issues in the failures was trying to bring the players together in the supply chain, either the functions within the business or more particularly the different businesses involved who are stakeholders in the extended supply chain. So the suppliers, the manufacturers, the customers, the outsourced logistics providers, because there's a lot of fragmentation, as you know, across the supply chain. I can think particularly of Unilever, where I worked with the board in Rotterdam with a guy called Toon Edelman, who was on the executive of Unilever, and we knew Unilever across Europe was a mess. And this is public information. We've spoken about this on the public platform with Unilever. So the challenge was to try and improve the performance of the transport operation that Unilever has across Europe. When I say the transport operation, we counted 450 logistics service providers across Europe, all being engaged by the local operating companies. And the task initially was to get that 450 down to 250. Unilever was spending £500 million, and this is gained public information, on these 450 logistics service providers around Europe. And we knew there was huge inefficiencies in terms of lack of collaboration between the transport operators. Our intention was to get that 450 down to 250 and have an improved operation and a dramatic reduction in the cost. We totally failed. We failed because we could not get the operating companies to cooperate. They had their own business, their own P&L. Their job was to produce product X or product Y, consumer goods, ice cream, whatever it was, for their local market. And they had no interest whatsoever in the cost of transport. They just contracted it out. And so we failed. Of course, subsequent to that, huge, tremendous progress in Unilever. And we have now a Unilever that is operating around Europe effectively, with control tower in Poland, overseeing the transport operations. But it's incredible to see what actually goes on inside the boardroom when you start to look at these different businesses and these studies. So a lot of problems which have been challenging, Malcolm, some have been solved successfully, but not by one person, not by just different people, but by companies working together. And a lot of failures. It's interesting that the research that we've done shows the success rate of strategic studies. We also identified the barriers to success. And both in 2008 and in 2018, 80% of the barriers were people-related, 20% technical. So technology is essential, but it is by no means sufficient. The people challenges in 2008 were primarily about lack of support from the board for strategic developments. That's changed dramatically. By 2018, the board were involved because of the learning that businesses had been through. We'd like also to think, as a result of people reading our research reports, which were very practical and action-oriented research reports. But in 2018, 80% of the barriers were still people-related, but they were all around, I haven't got the resources to do this. I know what to do, but I haven't got time to do it. And the question was, how do senior managers do their job operationally and at the same time invest energy in future strategic thinking? And that was quite a challenge. But the key requirement in all of these was to engage, for the successful ones, the board. And in the Indonesia case, the CEO was a fantastic guy who then was replaced by an Indonesian woman, both very good CEOs and chairmen, where we started at the top and we developed a vision for the business. And the key requirements for strategic change are, it has to be vision-led, it has to be built upon the business strategy, and those are the starting points. So we don't start off with logistics, we start off with the business. From that, we look at the customer requirements now and the future, and we develop those to create a vision for the business, which we then need to get ownership of across the business. Then we can start to look at supply chain. And everything we looked at in supply chain in terms of new manufacturing facilities, changing the performance of manufacturing to move from lean to agile, putting in systems, was all customer-led, and collaboration inside the business was absolutely critical, and collaboration with their business partners. There are two ingredients to strategic change: technology and collaboration. Technology is essential, but it's not sufficient, and it has to be backed up by the focus on people at all levels. And I'm including here the CEO. If the CEO is not committed to the project and does not spend sufficient time, then it's not going to work. I remember saying to the CEO, I had breakfast with the CEO in Indonesia when we developed the vision and we were moving on to implementation. And he said, look, you've got 28 projects here. And my people tell me they're all needed. It's the only study I've done, Marco, whether we never discuss cost, which is a nice one, because they had to do this, and they trusted us to do it in the best way. And we had a huge team of our people and their people, because at the end of the day, they've got to take this on and run it themselves. But I said to the CEO, I said, look, you haven't got a supply chain director. He said, well, do you suggest we recruit one? I said, no, let's make one. So we created a supply chain director function by asking the production manager and the commercial manager, the production director and the commercial director, to act as the supply chain voice in the board, because they were both experienced people. And secondly, I said, you need somebody from the organisation who's going to see this through and make sure that the project is on track, both while we're doing it with you and also when we've gone. I said, you need somebody that I've called the guardian of the vision. He said, okay, Alan, yes. Anyway, I went back to the UK and I got a phone call saying, oh, I also said, by the way, this project has got to be on the board agenda of every board meeting. And it's not 5 minutes, it's got to be half an hour. He said, but we have a board meeting every month. I said, yes, it's got to be on the agenda of that board meeting. Anyway, so I went back to the UK and he phoned me up and said, Alan, they've got a board meeting in 2 weeks' time. As you suggested, I'll put it on the agenda, and I will do for every other board meeting. And so I went over to Indonesia and had a breakfast with him before the board meeting. And he said, I've also got the two directors they're briefed on supply chain leadership. He said, I've also got the guardian of the vision. So he wheeled in this lady called Carol Seymour, and he said, this is the guardian of the vision. And I knew her from, she'd worked on some of the projects. And she showed me a business card, and on her business card it had guardian of the vision. And that was really creative, because everywhere she went, people say, what do you do? She said, I'm the guardian of the vision. And that project was very successful. So it's vision-led, and the vision's got to be retained through the whole project. And I did say to him beforehand, I said, the sort of person you need as the guardian of the vision, I didn't actually mean to call her that, but call him or her that, but he did. And I said, he's somebody that is a rising star in the organisation, and somebody that's on projects so important, you can't possibly afford to take them off it. What you need to do is take that person off those projects. And one of the key learnings of strategy work is you've got to take it seriously, because the future of the business depends on it. So you need to put your best people on it, even if it means taking them off other projects. So that was some of the learning from those studies, Marco.
Thank you ever so much, Alan. For sure, you've operated at an extremely senior level in terms of looking for value creation within supply chain. And I think largely by simplification, these are major challenges. And I certainly applaud what you've done. My next question is, it probably is a more personal one, is what are you most proud of?
Okay. Thank you, Malcolm. Well, yeah, I mean, clearly I'm proud of some of the successes that I've been involved in with other people. But at a more personal note, the particular focus that I've tried to give in all that I do is to encourage people to engage in supply chain as a career at all levels and all people. So it's got to be inclusive.
And for that, you've certainly been successful.
Well, I set up the Young Professionals Forum when I was president of the UK, the CRT UK, and that's that. I was proud of that with other people. And when I was president of CRT International, I set up WILT, Women in Logistics and Transport, as a global initiative, and then rolled it out into 8 countries, including Saudi Arabia, interestingly. But the Saudi government wouldn't let us have the ceremony in Saudi. So we held it in Dubai. But that was an initiative which has gone from strength to strength, and I'm very proud of having been involved in that. I also appointed one of the jobs of international president is to find the next president, and I was very proud to appoint the first woman president of the CRT International, Dr. Dorothy Chan from Hong Kong, and that was a very proud moment in my life to introduce her. Apart from our patron, the Princess Royal, who was our first honorary president, but in terms of working president, Dorothy Chan, so that's good. And some other things come back to haunt you later on, Malcolm. So I had an email a few weeks ago from a lady called Chloe Zheng, who is an operational director of Microsoft in the US. And she said, you won't remember me, but I was with you in 2003, and you were running a workshop in the UK, and I came along as a fresh 23-year-old Chinese graduate, and you came up to me afterwards and said, will you join our advisory board? And I said to you, what can I offer you? I know nothing. I'm Chinese, and I'm fresh into the country. And you said, that's why we want you on the board. And she joined the board, and she remembered this, and she moved on to be a director of Microsoft. So, you know, these are the things this is a legacy I'm really proud of from a personal point of view. I'm also, of course, very proud of my family. In December 2006, I was interviewed by the press, and they said, what's the most important thing that's happened to you this year? Thinking I would say my OBE. I said, my oldest daughter got married. That's the most important thing that happened this year. And, you know, as you said in your introduction, the family is everything. So I was fortunate enough to meet my wife at Oxford, and she's absolutely wonderful. And I was asked, I was on a panel at Cranfield School of Management for MBA students, and they were asking the panel, what's the most important decision you ever made in your working life? And I said, choose the right partner and make sure that she or he chooses you. And that's the most important decision I made.
How many years together is it now, Alan?
52.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Really, congratulations. So anybody that's balanced family and had a successful marriage as well as doing all that you've done, it's notable. But perhaps in a slightly negative vein, what maybe has frustrated you most?
I think that, people, you can get frustrated with people, but remember that people are working within the environment in which they're placed or measured or rewarded. Although you may be frustrated by individuals because of their lack of vision or their lack of cooperation, you've got to put that in the context of the business they work within. So my frustration is not with people, it's with businesses. Businesses tend to think locally and act locally. You've got to act locally but think global. So not thinking outside the box is very frustrating. We've done a lot of work together in collaboration, and you'll remember Peter Surtees, who was
I do indeed.
He was a director of NUPEG, and he was also, his day job was European supply chain director of Kimberly-Clark. Peter Surtees is still the only European supply chain director that I've met who had collaboration with other businesses written in as part of his personal objectives. So, in other words, he was a promoter, as indeed you were, Marco, of collaboration, but it's got to have the support of your business. And so, the frustration for me is with businesses thinking internally and thinking parochially. The challenge is to think outside the box. And we both know the situation we try to tackle and still are tackling in NUPEG and other businesses, which is about the utilisation of vehicles around Europe. A third of HGVs running on the roads in Europe are empty, and of the ones not empty, they're about 60% full. And businesses don't appear to be capable of tackling this problem. If you look at European supply chains, it's like a plate of spaghetti where any individual strand of spaghetti has been designed optimally for the businesses it's linking together, which is fine. But if you put it all around, you just get a heap of spaghetti, which doesn't make sense because there's no connectivity between the various links. And that's that challenge that we've been working on, Marco, for 20 years, and it's still as severe as it was before. So that's very frustrating. I was on the advisory board of ALICE, and if you don't know what ALICE is, look it up on the website. ALICE, Alliance for Logistics Innovation by Collaboration Across Europe. And it's got a tremendous membership. It's a European supported organisation, but it is open to membership of UK companies, by the way. It's produced a blueprint for zero emissions via collaboration, bringing people together. And there's so many initiatives going on with the ALICE. I would recommend that to anybody to have a look at. But that's my frustration, Mark.
Alan, do you think businesses are a bit like people on occasion? So if you look at a person, they might have tasks and objectives laid out for them, and that's what they're going to be measured against. And our business is really the same in terms of when they're being tested, and they're probably tested by their investors and their shareholders, etc. What are they actually testing them on? And quite often it is arguably it might be parochial financial performance or level of growth. Is it the broader picture that the way that we're actually measuring the performance of business is too narrow? Well,
yes, it's a very good question, Malcolm, because if we look at publicly quoted businesses, the focus of the chief executive, the chairman, is often on the financial markets rather than on looking down at the company and how they're working. And as we all know, financial institutions can be very short-term. And short-termism is a huge challenge to businesses. And a lot of the irrational decisions we see made in business are as a result of the downward pressure from the investors, which is totally unhelpful. And the CEO is caught right in the middle, the chairman, whoever it is caught right in the middle between the operating needs of the business and the needs of the stock market. So yes, you can't separate that.
It doesn't seem, Alan, like a particularly sustainable model, really. And that might be a naive statement to make on the basis of on the basis of that, and nor do I want to put myself out on a limb to criticise the great and the good that are working extremely hard to operate our large-scale businesses. But it would seem to me that the dashboard's quite restricted. And that for me is it's probably a question a lot of the younger generations are asking now. What should we measure on?
I agree with you entirely, but we are where we are at the moment. So that is a challenge. It's a frustrating challenge.
Alan, do you feel that all is well in the land of logistics and supply chain at the moment? And why might you feel that?
Well, supply chain has matured beyond our imagination. And we have some truly excellent supply chains with some excellent people involved. So that's the good news. But there is still a tremendous issue in terms of genuine collaboration internally within the businesses and externally between different businesses. And it starts at the top. We've talked about the pressures on chief executives and chairman. The role of the supply chain leader is to lead the board in terms of supply chain thinking. And that's where the opportunity exists. Part of the research showed that, I go back to this research, to very practical research. In 2008, there were 50% of supply chain leaders on the executive board of their operating division, which was dramatically different from the last time I'd looked at it in 2002. But that was a figure of 50%. So where the supply chain leader, whatever they're called, are actually on the operating board of their division. By 2018, when we did the next report, that had increased to 75%. But it seems to have stuck a bit because there's some evidence that supply chain leaders in some businesses were on the board but weren't quite up to the task. So it does raise a question of leadership, both in the board by the chief executive or the chairman, and also leadership of supply chain. The research that I did, I ran the European Council on Global Supply Chain. I was chairman, then project director of that in Brussels. And we did a study which looked at successful supply chain leaders around Europe. And we found out that they were what we call T-shaped. In other words, they had a very broad skill set as well as some detailed knowledge. In other words, imagine the letter T. The skill set in terms of deep knowledge of supply chain is the upright bit. And then the bar across the top is the breadth of that individual. And the breadth, we found out, was actually very, 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 very significant. And how did they get that breadth? Was because they'd had zigzag careers. In other words, they knew they'd worked in, if they're a manufacturer, they'd worked in retailing, they'd worked in finance, they'd worked in procurement or whatever. But that concept of a zigzag career to enable the leaders to have that breadth, it was seen to be absolutely critical. And that's something that I think we need to work on more, because if you look at the way in which people's careers are managed within businesses, they tend to be vertical silos. And I never forget there's an organisation set up by the government called Skills for Logistics, who produced this ladder to success, showing how somebody at an operational level in a warehouse or transport operation could be a director by going up through the layers. That is very old-fashioned thinking. The leaders of today and of the future have got to have this breadth, which you only get by a zigzag career. And the challenge, Malcolm, is that this may mean moving between companies, not just functions. It may not be in a company's interest to create this zigzag career because they might lose people. But, if you lose some people, you'll gain others. So that's an industry-wide issue about leadership, which we need to actually tackle.
I certainly support the view on zigzag career. I think the wonderful thing that I have had is the good fortune to interview people that did start at the base of the logistics industry and now actually leading within that. But that doesn't break what you've said. On my own basis, I've moved around on the basis of I want to do what interests me. And I do what I do now because I'm continually fascinated. And I like variety is the spice of life, and I like the variety of problems that we get to solve. So I certainly agree with you there. What are your thoughts on the interface between industry and academia? Because this is something that I believe you've done extremely well, and I certainly view that relationships with academic organisations. For instance, we have one with Manchester Metropolitan University, which I really value. I think there's a lot to be gained by it. It's a bit like real, pure academic thought and ideas meeting practical application. That's what it means for me. What does it mean for you? Because you did more of it.
Yeah, I'm totally on the same page as yourself in terms of recognising the issue. My experience in industry with British Steel and with the companies I worked with led me to believe that the word academic was a dirty word. So it's used as a derogative word to say, well, that solution is just academic. Academic means it doesn't work. And that is something that I've tried to get away from. Equally well, I've worked in academia at Leicester School of Management, then I was at Warwick University Business School, and the word practical was a dirty word. So I remember when I joined Cranfield to set up the Cranfield Centre for what is now the Cranfield Centre for Logistics and Supply Chain Management. My former colleagues at Warwick said, "Cranfield, that's a bit practical, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, it is." And so I went to Cranfield because Cranfield has always had. I did my master's degree at Cranfield. It's always had a very, very strong industrial link. And in fact, when I joined Cranfield to do my master's degree, Cranfield had 90% of its funding from industry and 10% from government, whereas most universities were the other way around. So yeah, I regard myself as a pracademic, which is a practical academic. It may not come over very well, but that's what I've always tried to do. I set my objective to close the gap between industry and academia, and that's what I've worked on as a sort of as a mission as part of all the work that I've done. In fact, Malcolm, if you remember, when if you look at the Cranfield notepad in front of me, and it says transforming knowledge into action, that's the strapline.
Yep.
And we developed that. I was on the advisory board of Cranfield School of Management when it was first set up 10 years ago, and we developed this strapline. What does Cranfield actually do, and how does it differentiate between other universities and business schools? Because it's action. It's transforming knowledge into action. It's not research for the sake of research. Research in industry is pointless unless it can be used.
And I'd certainly agree that point. But I think just as much as there is a duty of academia to reach out and try and be more pragmatic, there's also a view of industry needing to say and be honest about the problems that they're having difficulty solving and finding new ideas that might actually help them solve those problems. And, one might argue, so let's be a little bit controversial. If we were looking at transportation only in a European environment, and we said that the result of all of the well-meaning and well-focused activities to deliver fulfillment to the customer results in a substantial percentage of vehicles being either underutilised or unutilised, that as a result of this, all of these exercises in good intention actually doesn't sound that good. So that leads me to my next question, and perhaps I didn't want to lead you into an answer, but what do you think are the challenges in logistics and supply chain that we've not yet been able to solve?
Well, I have to come back to the word collaboration. It is about working within organisations, between organisations. That is the soft spot. There are some other technical issues. We've got to move from lean. I talked about lean thinking earlier on, which is the way in which manufacturing companies tended to go. And lean manufacturing is all very well, but if you haven't got agility, then it doesn't tick the box. So we've got to move from lean to agile, which means being responsive, not necessarily minimising cost, but having agility. And we pay a little bit of a price for agility, maybe. But there are ways of getting lean and agile to work together. Postponement being an example of a technique that you can do to get lean manufacturing up front, and agility in other activities down the supply chain. But there are other techniques we've got to start to think about. As I said earlier on, we're coming through a very difficult time in terms of world supply chain performance. geopolitics and challenges on energy and so forth, and sourcing problems. So we're having to go through now, I believe, an era of major strategic change where the strategies that we put in place for the single Europe market, for example, or to meet the opportunities of globalization, need to be revised, not changed necessarily dramatically, but they've got to be revisited. And that is, I think, something that needs to be done. And if it's going to be done over the next 3, 4, 5 years, it's got to be started now. So on top of all the current problems in terms of sorting out the issues in the supply chain today and the firefighting, we've got to actually start to think about how we would strategically redesign our business supply chains globally in terms of sourcing, nearshoring, offshore, whatever it might be. But the time is imminent now for doing that. And I think if we don't do it now, we'll regret it later on.
I certainly agree with you, Alan. I mean, my sort of considered thoughts on it, if I may, are, yes, a journey from lean to agile makes eminent sense. But also looking at strategy, shouldn't that be agile as well?
Absolutely.
So we say, well, okay, we've found the answer. We've invested money to find the answer. That is generally based on the operating conditions of today and doesn't necessarily have a risk model behind it that says, okay, circumstances are changing, it's time for you to actually review whether or not this strategy is still relevant. So offshoring might be one example of that, or even going back to your centres of manufacturing excellence within the circumstances change. And so ideally, the agile strategy would actually adapt with it and say, well, okay, don't do strategic action 2B.1. Now you need to go down to 2B.2 instead. So I'm going to ask a complicated question, but I think you'll get it. So the starting point is, why do you feel that collaboration in industry is key? And what do you think, therefore, would be the outcome if we could get industry out of its many silos and get them collaborating? And finally, what do you think is stopping us from achieving more than has been?
That's a big question. Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. I remember going to a senior workshop in Istanbul. It was a meeting of the CEO Forum with chief executives from retailers and manufacturers who get together on various topics around the world. And this was a meeting of chief executives in Istanbul, specifically to talk about supply chain. I wasn't there to talk about industrial supply chain. In fact, I was presenting as a trustee of TransAid to try and get their support for the TransAid, which is Transport for Africa, where I was a trustee at that time. But I was there, fortunately, to hear the whole proceedings. And there was a presentation on what the world could look like if all the manufacturing and retailer companies in the world put all their product together. And it was some work done by, I'm not quite sure, I think it was Ernst & Young. And they produced two configurations. One was how the world worked as now, in terms of supply chains, a complete mess, if you like. Very, very complicated, very inefficient. One where all the product from different parts of the world was consolidated in terms of moving across the world and moving out in a consolidated way to all the customer centres. And it wasn't a simple diagram, but by gum, it was simplified. And the estimate was that the cost would be, the consultants did an estimate that the cost would be something like a third. Totally unrealistic, of course. But the ultimate prize in collaboration is huge. If that was just an indicator of what could be achieved, it can't be achieved because people will never do that. When I was working with Unilever, I'm going back a long time when this was the case, first of all. If you mentioned Procter & Gamble in a Unilever meeting, you'd literally be asked to leave the room. You would leave the room. And then, in the early 2000s, I was with Unilever when they were collaborating with Procter & Gamble on warehousing space. So the world's changed dramatically. This concept that the source of competition is in the truck. The source of competition is not in the truck. The source of competition is on the shelf and the availability and the functionality of the product. So, and there's still that attitude. If we didn't collaborate, we'd all be chartering private planes around the world for ourselves. Every time we get on an airplane, we collaborate. So this concept of we can't work with the enemy, but we can do things together. So that's There's a still similar attitude. I think it's going there, Marco. But the prize of collaboration is huge.
I'd certainly agree. But you might say, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? But the essence for me is you start with a financial perspective, but then all of a sudden we've now got, and I know some argue not, but the majority of academic view says we have a real issue in terms of climate change and global warming, and we need to be able to get our emissions down. This has to drive some force of change, and it will drive change, I feel, in a number of ways. Even given that, even looking at the change of technology, let's say in terms of a truck, will that be as easy to run? Have an 800-mile range without refueling, or will you going to have 100 miles on electric? Or if you're going to have a hybrid vehicle, what's going to be the loss of payload? Or if you've got a battery vehicle, again, what is going to be the loss of payload? What it is, I think it's going to change completely our supply chains, how they work for the future. But I think the other big prize, Alan, in terms of collaboration, if we can get it done, is about modal shift. I get mightily frustrated from a parochial UK perspective that we live on an island.
Yep.
And yet we talk about lack of infrastructure and cost of infrastructure, and yet we move so little by sea. We don't do anything in terms of anything major other than aggregates, for example, in terms of coastal shipping in this country. And you look at it and you would say even a horrible old ro-ro ferry burning heavy marine diesel is 50 times less emissive based on a truckload quantity than a single truck by unit. And so how do you drive that change? Well, the only way you drive that change is by looking at the problem in a different way.
Well, a move from rail is the same. Any move of substantial product to rail or short street shipping is about volume.
Yep.
And so you only get the volume by collaboration.
Yep.
If you put the stuff together, and we've done work together, Malcolm, on seeing we can change the flow of goods around Europe. And push them together, we justify a block train. So forget about the rail wagon. Block trains, and of course they are used by many companies, but it's few and far between at the moment.
Yep.
And the same is true of shipping.
I would always look at block to shipping. I mean, if we want to recreate and revitalise our ports in this country, for me, I would say, I'm from Merseyside originally, so I've maybe got a vested interest. I'd like to see our ports even busier than they are today.
Yeah, I agree.
So now, Gypsy Rose Waller, I'm here for a reading. And my reading is, what does the future hold for the logistics and supply chain industry? My first question, are you going to use tea leaves, cards, or a crystal ball, Alan? Or are you, what's it going to be?
Well, I think something diagrammatic is always good.
Okay.
And I still come back to the words like T-shaped and zigzag.
Okay, T-shaped and zigzag.
In terms of the because the leadership is the future has got to be driven by leaders and to produce new leaders, and I think we're entering an era where we've got to actually take leadership more seriously, and we've got to encourage people from outside supply chain to come into supply chain.
I agree.
Supply chain is not. Supply chain shouldn't hog the road in terms of who does it. So, a lot of the companies that I work with now are bringing in supply chain leaders who know very little about supply chain. That may sound silly, but I go back to my T-shaped, where the breadth is more important than the depth. And it's more important to have a supply chain leader that can talk the language of the boardroom and understands procurement and understands retailing, understands the customer, than it is to have a supply chain leader who understands about warehousing and transport planning systems. So supply chain, it may be the word supply chain is the wrong word, Marco, but we're looking at leadership in the boardroom of all the things that supply chain does. And the ideal, of course, is to have that person as the CEO or the chairman. And so, to have a world where supply chain is fully understood and driven at the top would be the ideal for me.
It's never been a supply chain though, Alan, has it? It's always been a supply network, and more appropriately, a network of supply networks. It always has been more.
Oh yeah, it's difficult, and it always will be.
Yeah.
But I remember when I was running the European Council on Global Supply Chain in Brussels, I was always looking for very good speakers from very good companies, and I managed to get hold of Zara and said, look, you've got to, and because they're very difficult to get on the platform, Zara are almost impossible to get on the platform. But I had a contact who I'd met, and I found the right person. I said, look, can you come and address the European Council on Global Supply Chain? Here are the CEOs and supply chain leaders of some of the Europeans' biggest companies, and we want to hear your story on supply chain. And I was amazed when they asked, because I said, you've got a great supply chain model. They said, that's not a supply chain model, that's our business model. And they took umbrage to the fact that I described it as a supply chain model. I mean, clearly it is a supply chain model. If you compare Zara to, I'm not insulting Marks and Spencer, I still shop there, but Marks and Spencer's where they've got, these seasons of the year, they have to plan ahead and they get all the sizing wrong and they get the wrong stuff in the wrong place. Zara is highly responsive, agile, and does things instantly. But they regard their model not as a supply chain model, but as their business model. And that's what we've got to get into people's heads. It isn't supply chain trying to take over the world. This is business trying to work differently.
I actually think we need to start renaming it as the science of making things happen, and we need to have our new magicians that are there and make it all happen. Because I said earlier, supply chain is absolutely magical, and I think it needs due respect.
I totally agree. Well, it's a fantastic career. I mean, one of the objectives clearly of this podcast is to get people who don't work in supply chain to work in supply chain. I mean, it's a fantastic area. As I said, it's top to bottom, it's end to end. It's challenging, it's interesting. You can get career progression beyond your wildest dreams. You can get money beyond your wildest dreams. I've achieved things I never thought would be possible, and I already played with it. So I would, I do say that this is the future of the future profession to go for. The supply chain's got to be in there amongst the leaders, Malcolm.
Absolutely agree, Alan. So, look, in conclusion, when you first entered the world of logistics and supply chain, it was the Cinderella of business functions. It wasn't well regarded. It wasn't really even thought of in those terms. It was distribution, warehousing, and transport, and maybe with a bit of planning over the top. Thanks in part to your efforts, we now have a function that is valued by every organisation and represented on many boards. We have people studying logistics and supply chain, and bright people establishing their careers and developing new and exciting futures for the industry. So, you've helped Cinderella find her Prince Charming, and because of that, I think you're the king of logistics. So, thank you for all that you've done. And we wish you a wonderful partial retirement, although I'm going to do my best to encourage you a little bit out of it, with a little time to spend on dreaming new futures for the rest of us to be inspired by. Alan, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and thank you.
Malcolm, my pleasure as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Logistics Collective podcast. We publish on www.logisticscollective.com, and you can register on there and you can get some reminders. You can also interact with us. You can send us voice messages. And what do we have coming? We have a whole list of people that I'm due to interview. But this is a pleasure and a passion of mine, and I hope you find it as perhaps entertaining as I do. It's lovely to talk to people.
You can get in contact by email, podcast@logisticscollective.com, or leave a voice message on our website, logisticscollective.com. The podcast is a production by Le Guru.